So a few years ago, I posted a video of the top 20 horror soundtracks of all time. And I'll put that up here so you can check that out if you haven't seen it. But I got a lot of comments that said that I didn't include a lot of the newer scores. So in this video, we're going to count down the top 10 horror movie scores of the last 20 or so years. So let's get into it. Unfortunately, for copyright reasons, I'm not able to put any of the music in this video. So I'll leave links below the description for each of the soundtracks. The visceral sounds from the Greek duo MMMD make Hagazusa a one-of-a-kind folk horror experience. Using instruments they've built along with traditional folk instruments, MMD forges a new path in the horror score landscape. The score has a primitive sound and feels timeless, almost as if the music has always existed. The hypnotic effect of the slowly changing tones make us feel as if we were in a fevered dream. We lose our sense of time in the music and the imagery. There is an oppressive atmosphere, and yet a stark beauty in it. In the final sequence, the main character hallucinates, and both the sound and the visuals cause the viewer to question what is real. Mika Levy's score for Under the Skin feels like a strange ritual. In this way, it reminds me of the Hikaru Hayashi's soundtrack to the 1968 film KURONEKO. I'll leave a link for that below. Levy's violin playing and electronic manipulation brought a bold sound to this very original soundtrack. What makes the score truly unique is Levy's approach to the performance. The playing is very unconventional, often with no vibrato and a lot of portamento, which means when you slide from note to note. The sul ponticello, or playing very close to the bridge, gives us a very flute-like and hollow sound, adding to the cold calculation of the alien woman hunting her prey. The score for Drag Me to Hell is Christopher Young at his finest. The first two Hellraiser movies rank in my mind as two of the greatest horror film scores ever created. The Drag Me to Hell score is probably one of the more traditional scores on this list in terms of instrumentation. But Young's bold and inventive orchestration, his great use of color and timbre, is second to none. The final track, Auto da Fe, is an absolute tour de force of orchestration and composition. The sheer energy and bombastic nature of the track offer a more than ample backdrop to the climax of the film. The tone of the score fits perfectly with the ancient curse theme, which is why I believe he stuck with a fairly traditional ensemble for the soundtrack. The scores of Christopher Young always maintain a lofty elegance, even amidst the chaos. His thematic writing is a standout in this list, as most of the newer scores focus more on color and timbre. There is a sublime beauty to Bobby Krlik's score for Midsommar. It floats over the top of the film with a detached reverie. Harkening to the impressionist sound of Debussy and Ravel, it also conjures up Sibelius at times. Pastoral in a way, but also a dream of the past, especially in tracks like The Fire Temple and The House That Harga Built. We get a strange 1960s fairy tale vibe with the Prophecy track, adding to the psychedelic quality of the film. The instrumentation primarily relies on strings and extended techniques, but we also get great sound design and sonic sculpture in ambient tracks like Helsingland. The score is effective in combining such disparate elements as the golden age of Hollywood, that romantic sound, experimental dissonance, rich ambient textures, and finally, folk elements of Scandinavia. Kenji Kawai's score for Ringu is such an integral part of the film. The music becomes the sound of the curse itself. The eerie percussion is sparse and punctuates the silence in between, exemplifying the Japanese aesthetic of space. His use of the FM synth tone to mark the days is a brilliant refrain, and becomes an ominous reminder of the inescapable doom of the curse. The pitched down sounds are a perfect accompaniment of the grainy VHS footage. Kawai also touches on the humanity of the main characters at critical points of the film. By using intimate piano, strings, and soft synth pads, he helps us empathize with the main characters before the final climax of the film. Kawai's masterful mix of strings, synth, and manipulated sounds make the score so memorable and effective. The late Jóhann Jóhannsson never failed to create a totally fresh and powerful sonic experience. From Sicario, Theory of Everything, and Arrival, to his raw and gritty score for Mandy, which we'll talk about here. The sound of Mandy in some ways picks up where Howard Shore's score for Cronenberg's Crash left off. I'll leave a link to that below. The sound of electric distorted guitars brings an unrefined energy to the score. Jóhannsson enlists Stephen O'Malley from the band Sun to bring the drony and heavy guitars into the mix. The wild sonic palette fits beautifully with the unbridled madness of the film. But there is always a subtle, minimalist approach to Johansson's work, even in this type of heavy score. The love theme is a perfect example of this. There is a profound feeling in the lonely melody that gives emotional weight to Cage's character. We feel his love for his wife and understand his loss and need to avenge her death. Rich, spacey synths add to the sonic universe and put us squarely in the visual strangeness of the world the director has created. Johansson further heightens the tension with noisy percussion and low synth ostinatos. A great example of this is in the track Dive Bomb Blues. Johansson is always thinking thematically, and at the end he brings back the love theme. Mark Korven captures the horror and isolation superbly with his groundbreaking score for The Witch. His use of the nyckelharpa, a Scandinavian keyed string instrument similar to the hurdy-gurdy, is the perfect choice for an intimate folk horror experience. Korven also had a special instrument made for the soundtrack called the Apprehension engine, and I'll leave a link in the description below to a video explaining the instrument. The otherworldly tones of this instrument give the score a unique sound world, particular to the film. The clusters in the voice give us that Ligeti vibe and adds to the eeriness of the score. The sound of the voice also signifies a beckoning and a promise put to Tomlinson's character, calling her to perhaps embrace freedom and her true nature as a woman. This is especially evident in the final Witch's Coven scene, where we hear sung parts interspersed with raw guttural chanting. Rich Vreeland, also known as Disasterpiece, burst onto the scene with his fantastic score for the video game Fez. The game soundtrack is ambient and textural, conjuring up feelings of Debussy and Ravel. However, when the sound of It Follows hits us, we know we are very far from the soothing world of Fez. The first track, Heals, builds to an unrelenting percussive assault, amidst a very unique electronic sound world. Dirty, bit-crushed sounds are a pervasive texture in the score. Disasterpiece usually creates all his electronic sounds from scratch, so there is always a distinctive sound to his work. The main titles for the film give us a nostalgic 80s horror vibe, conjuring up the sounds of John Carpenter and Goblin. At certain parts of the film we also get that dissonant cluster writing and a lot of falling string sounds, much like in the work of Ligeti and Penderecki. But for me, what makes this soundtrack so special are the quiet moments we get with the group of teenage protagonists. Rich synth textures and beautiful ambient melodies exemplifies Disasterpiece's work. It's this contrast of dark and light that give the soundtrack such power and effectiveness. Woodwinds are rarely used in horror scores, which I think is why Colin Stetson's score for Hereditary is so novel. Stetson's woodwind playing adds a unique character to the horror soundtrack landscape. It's apparent that he's influenced by the French spectralist school of Grisset and Morel, but we also hear an influence from the 60s and 70s composers of the avant-garde. This gives a strong foundation to the experimental music in his score, and it's apparent that he's steeped in these traditions and not just mimicking that horror sound. His use of the Eric oboe in the Get Out track reminds me of Toru Takamisu's use of that same instrument in the film Double Suicide. Rounding out the sonic landscape is Stetson's use of voice and unnerving low synth pulsing. Hildur Guðnadóttir's score for Chernobyl not only tops this list, but it positions her firmly in the pantheon of great horror score composers. The way she captured the unseen terror of radiation in her soundtrack was absolutely chilling. She utilized field recordings she made from actual nuclear power plants as part of the score. Combining the desolation and coldness of these samples with her solo cello playing was an absolute stroke of genius. She also used the choir very sparingly at key moments to heighten the feeling of human loss and tragedy. The blurred lines between sound and music is what makes the score so interesting and effective. She found a powerful sound analogy for the strangeness and horror of radiation in her score. So that's the list. I'm sure I'll get a lot of comments with some disagreements, but I actually like that. I hope we can have a discussion about all the great scores in the past 20 years or so. I know Ringu is actually 1998, so technically it's still from the 20th century, but I really wanted to include that one because I think it's such a powerful part of the film. There was some that it was hard to cut from the list. Saw was one of them that I had on the list for a while, but which is a great score as well. I also had Annihilation was one that I really didn't want to cut, so maybe do that as like an honorable mention, but that's a great score too. But yeah, there are a lot of good ones that didn't quite make the list, but anyway, thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.